Hello, my dear furniture, it's Tables, and if you follow me over on Twitter, you would know I am very passionate about all kinds of literature, especially Danmei. Queer media is very important to me, for obvious reason, as I'm a queer man and like having representation. But what happens when the wrong demographic feels the need to comment about queer media? Especially when that person has access to a very large and influential outlet. That's right, we're talking about The Guardian's recent article about Danmei and its inaccuracies, racism, and prejudice. Published on Sunday, the 12th of March 2023, journalist Helen Sullivan releases an article titled, China's Rotten Girls Are Escaping into Erotic Fiction About Gay Men. In case you haven't read it yet, I'll give you the link in the top right and in the video's description. I welcome any fact checkers for this video, as obviously I'm also a white person and American at that. So if I get anything wrong, please correct me in the comments below. I am basing some of this video on the common responses from Twitter. Helen Sullivan is a political scientist who writes about public interests and has previously written about the Russia-Ukraine war, Chinese interests, and more about the Russia-Ukraine war. The grand majority of her track record is covering the war, and the few times she's written something else recently is about China or animals. Her education is listed as having 3 years at the University of Birmingham, between the years 1985 and 1988. She's described as a socialist feminist, but her most recent article isn't feminist at all. In fact, it has many inaccuracies, lies, racist undertones, and a very prominent and obvious lack of research. Join me on this journey as we try to uncover what the hell this article is supposed to convey. We start off with an excerpt from Tian Guan Sifu, or Heaven's Official Blessing, which quotes one of the, 3 total kiss scenes in the entire series? One thing I found very compelling is that Sullivan uses the idea of kiss scenes, what few there are, to warrant calling Danmei an inherently erotic genre? However, later she goes to talk about the heavy censorship that the genre is subject to, including mentioning the number of cancellations of pieces, further censorship laws being put into place, and even talking about the incarcerations that Danmei authors face. Right there is a warning that Sullivan's research into this topic is superficial at best, glossing over several other facets of the genre that readers come to understand through basic interaction with other fans. Sullivan has at least done enough research to know there's a mushroom character in Danmei, but goes on to parrot Shizuku Una's claim that Danmei embodies a third gender, in the form of androgyny, as many Danmei feature long hair and delicate angular features. However, that idea is based on racism. In case you don't know, men had long hair in Chinese history and culture, and although that isn't true now, a lot of Danmei take inspiration in important cultural and historical ideas and give it a new story. Sullivan and Ueno clearly have no understanding of this, otherwise they wouldn't have said something so incorrect. Additionally, the idea of a strong masculine man has changed throughout Chinese history, and being a beauty is a part of masculinity in modern China. Sullivan even has a source mentioning how many Danmei stories derive from traditional Chinese concept, but fails to mention the cultural norms of the individual. Now, her claim for the androgyny idea are led by the false concept that Danmei is a straight female-only demographic. The fact that I'm sitting here talking to a camera proves otherwise. And while she has the decency to quote Japanese sources, those sources don't have the authority to discuss Danmei. And some of Sullivan's article derives from Megan Walsh, an apparent Chinese specialized literature journalist, who quotes, "Getting pregnant is a real pain for romance. They like the fact that it's not a girl who is suffering in love. They like that the jeopardy and the heartache and the risks associated with illicit relations aren't played out upon a girl's body." And although I could dog on Walsh about how incorrect and assumptuous that claim would be, I feel the need to talk about what Walsh has published in relation to Danmei. Her largest credited work on any Chinese literature is The Subplot, an overall study on all Chinese literature and its impacts on Chinese culture. And I may not have a copy of said work. I located an article review on the piece, and what it says doesn't paint Walsh as an accredited source on Danmei. The article in question, by the Smart Set, writes, "Readers of Mojang Tongzhu will be interested to know her 3 paperback New York Times bestsellers are properly situated within a larger context of Danmei. Largely homoerotic fantasy, principally serialized for online consumption." After reading the rest of the article, I can give credit to Walsh on her observation that Chinese literature as a whole is more socialist than Chinese censorship would lead you to believe, mostly analyzing online novels written with some separation from publishing restrictions. However, the findings by the smart set leads credence to the idea that Walsh isn't as educated on Danmei as both the genre and its impacts on culture. Generally speaking, a reader of Mojang Tongzhu will not only know about Danmei, but also be a reader of other Danmei. In fact, MXTX is commonly referred to as a Danmei author as her credit, marking her almost solely as being known for her well-known and popular Danmei works over anything else. Sullivan goes as far as to bring up AO3 in reference to Danmei authors. Another show of just how much effort she has put into understanding this topic. She claims AO3 is used by Danmei authors themselves to skirt censorship laws. However, that couldn't be farther from the truth. Any given member of fandom understands AO3 as a representation of fandom power and love, a place by fans for fans. That notion is Archive of Our Own's infamous catchphrase, and a place inaccessible by most Chinese consumers. Now, AO3 has a history of being banned in places where there are heavy censorship laws. And this holds true in China, where any Danmei fiction posted to the site is by and large written by a non-native fan of China. Sullivan also quotes Walsh's idea that Danmei is almost entirely by women for women, using evidence in the form of a lack of typical female issues in the genre as a sign that women use Danmei as an escape from reality, a reality that Walsh believes is entirely about pregnancy, marriage, and autonomy control, although it is true in Asian culture that women face more heavy societal pressure. Danmei and BL's general popularity lies elsewhere, given that the stereotype of straight women for straight women has been disproved through several other journalists, literary professors, and perhaps the most ignored source, Fandom. Sullivan refers to Vox's article about Xinglong. However, Sullivan lacks the clarity of Vox's main point of the article. On October 17, 2022, author Romano, I believe it's pronounced, writes about Xinglong, where President Xi Jinping's crackdown on media that threatens China's traditional values. Sullivan mentions this concept and the effects afterward on Danmei, mentioning the mass cancelizations, and going on to talk about the legal trouble Danmei authors face. Romano's main premise of this article, however, is not about how Xinglong has affected Danmei. Rather, Romano discusses Xi Jinping's, and by extension, the Chinese Communist Party's, biggest failures in their efforts to fight against rising interest in non-traditional values in media. Now, this relates to Sullivan, and has both failed to understand fandom at its core, and probably will never understand. Fans have always and will always be unpredictable and unshaking in our love and passion. Romano writes, fans, locally or abroad, are motivated by deeply personal, often Byzantine motivations that no amount of outside interference, even from the Chinese government, can moderate. In fact, fandom is more accessible and widespread than ever. Romano further mentioning how fandom seemed to grow even stronger in the face of CCP's censorship efforts. Danmei's biggest and most reliable source of any given information would come from fandom, an idea both Sullivan and Walsh neglected to consider. Fandom houses wiki, discussions, and archives of information that can be easily accessed at any time and place. However, Sullivan and other speakers have practically refused these sources. They speak to each other through articles that they looked into superficially while ignoring founded and reliable sources on the subject matter. This handling of Danmei and of any literature is insensitive and insulting. Should they have consulted with fandom, their statements could have been made more factually and with less unintended bigotry. We have the knowledge of what Danmei is constituted as erotica or suggestive, or TGCF's treatment and position as erotica. What Danmei regularly derives from, culture and history along with genre subtypes. Who writes and consumes Danmei? Queer and male consumers taking up a large portion. What Danmei often depicts, subverts gender norms, pregnancy, sexual violence, sex-based discrimination, and societal pressure, and how much Danmei has impacted culture, adaptations, demographics, and censorships. Sullivan's attempt to write about Danmei in an informative manner was ruined by her own disingenuous effort and accidental insults. Not only that, but this article is only a part of a written study of feminist literature in China and its impacts. Although Sullivan and her associates are correct in the idea that Danmei is inherently a feminist genre, their own preconceptions and knowledge of Danmei has betrayed them. Even giving Sullivan the benefit of doubt, she still uses an article that discusses in depth about fandom and its power, yet opted to still ignore fandom's assets. Sullivan's piece can only be read as a letter of ignorance, meant to give an uninformed party their wrong information and ideas, concepts easily amended by using Fandom. Now let this be a lesson to other journalists and speakers. To understand fully and completely before speaking on a subject is a better love letter than learning about it and only looking at the very basics of it. Always research and study thoroughly and defer to reliable sources and experts. Sullivan's article should be taken as a bad example and not be used in any serious conversation. But that marks the end of this video. If you liked it, consider hitting the subscribe button and comment what else you would like to see. This is Tables, asking you to read more books, follow them on Twitter, and to understand fandom as a hungry beast.